Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to, or good morning, or whatever time of day it is for you, actually. Welcome to the week 4 video for the shark negotiation that you will have completed in class this week. This negotiation is on social dilemmas. Let's start by talking a little bit about what a social dilemma is. So, as I've noted in class, a social dilemma is a situation in which the majority, or not the majority, the whole group can benefit if everybody cooperates. But if one person decides not to cooperate, then that individual can benefit more than the group. A social dilemma is a resource dilemma, and I gave a few examples in class, but certainly for your information again, there are all kinds of social dilemmas. You take part in social dilemmas all the time when you organize your group work. There are also social dilemmas that revolve around pricing, advertising wars, and military competition. There's any time where there's a competition where more or less resources are being there's a scarcity of resources that are being competed for. There's an opportunity for a social dilemma. Here are some of the properties of a social dilemma. In a social dilemma, each individual receives a higher payoff for defecting than for cooperating. So it pays more to behave in a way that is consistent with your own outcomes, or behave in a way that capitalizes or maximizes your own outcomes, regardless, and not paying attention to the outcomes of others. So the individual payoff for, but at the same time, if everybody in the group decides not to defect, then there is no payoff. The resources available are quite scarce, and nobody wins. So the payoff for universal defection are lower than for universal cooperation. If we all cooperate, we all do well. If we all defect, we do not do well. But if only one of us defects, then that individual does better than the rest of the group. That is a social dilemma. I gave the example in class of the prisoner's dilemma as being a type of social dilemma. But social dilemmas in general, that's a subcategory. So social dilemmas in general differ from the specific case of the prisoner's dilemma because there's more than two people and the parties have an opportunity to discuss all of the issues on the table, which actually makes this broader case of a social dilemma much easier to resolve, much easier to solve, something to keep in mind. If we could talk for a moment about the idea of asymmetry within a social dilemma. In a social dilemma, incentive structures vary from one party to another, so it's not clear how resources can be divided. It appears as though resources they're unequal between each party's members. So there's no clear way of articulating or determining who gets what. There's also an uncertainty about what is fair, and it allows for different interpretations of fairness. So in the shark example, there are competing ideas. There's of course the idea of the saving the sharks and conservation, but then each individual within their case has variance in terms of how important the sharks are to their business, the way in which they use the sharks, and all of these lend to different interpretations and different arguments as to what is fair and what is not fair. So judgments of fairness are biased in an egocentric or self-serving manner. We'll come back to this idea again later on in this lecture, but we did again raise this in class, the idea that our judgments of what is fair is based on our own perspective. So we often view fairness depending on who we are and the perspective that we've taken in a given negotiation. So if we believe heavily or we believe strongly in our own viewpoint, or we adopt our own viewpoint and see the problem through that lens, it can lead to problems such as overharvesting or defection. So how do you find your way out of these dilemmas? How do you figure out what to do? So some of you hit on this quite well during your group negotiations. There's a need to cooperate in order to find your way out of a group dilemma. And you might be able to do that to get others to cooperate with you if this is indeed important to you, to ensure that everybody stays on board so that you can all benefit, rather than if you all defect and nobody cooperates, then you end up all suffering. So the issue here is that you could signal your intent through strategy, right? So you could signal your intent to cooperate. Uh, let other people know that you intend to cooperate. Keep your messages simple. This is the first point. If you keep it simple and you're straightforward in your dealings with the other parties, they'll know how to respond to you. You'll also want to behave in ways that are reciprocal, tit for tat. So follow cooperation with cooperation. And in the case of defection, there's a need to follow a defection with a defection. But by all means, do not be the first to defect. As you can well imagine, if somebody is the first to defect, it sends a message to the rest of the group that you are likely to defect in future, and you'll have a very difficult time making deals with the other parties if indeed this is as in the shark negotiation, where you have to share this resource year over year. You'll have a very hard time convincing others that you're willing to cooperate with them in successive years. This is very similar to the example I had in class around the airlines and their frequent flyer loyalty points, and the fact that we lost billions of dollars when American Airlines first instituted the loyalty point system. And this was largely due to a downward spiral of defection. American Airlines was the first to offer these points, and then the competition just began from there. So the other point that I wanted to come back to was this idea of the ego, the fact that we have this self-serving bias that exists within a negotiation, particularly a social dilemma, when we are looking at what the other person is asking for, or what they are trying to achieve. And there are some pretty important points in order to avoid this kind of trap of this negative spiral where everybody starts to lose. There's a need to ensure that you avoid certain behaviors that can exacerbate this effect. The first is, don't be envious. So remember that since the beginning of the class, we've been talking about setting our aspiration points, setting our goals, and comparing whether or not we've been successful in a negotiation to whether or not we've come close to achieving our aspirations. We've come close to our goals. So don't be envious of the other party. They have set different metrics for themselves, different numbers. You have to think of your own payoffs, not your own payoffs relative to other parties. It's especially important when we're talking about solutions that are asymmetric, solutions whereby different people will get different values because they are entitled to different amounts, or because we've always received at different ratios of a total volume. So it's very easy to look at large commercial and think that they're getting too much of the shark, but proportionally they've cut their harvesting quite significantly. So you can't really; those are difficult things to compare. You cannot compare them, make direct comparisons. So be cautious of that, as that can lead to perceptions of unfairness and difficulties with cooperating, which becomes especially important under conditions of a social dilemma. The second issue here is the egocentric interpretation of fairness. So be aware that you are viewing the problem through a lens that is colored by your own position. Be aware of this bias and find ways of dealing with it. So some classic ways of dealing with it, and economists have a lot of advice for us on this point. You might be familiar with the first point here. One person splits the pie, the other chooses it. You may have done, if you have a sibling and you were raised in a household with a sibling, you or your parent may have offered this solution to you at times. If you only have one cookie, one person cuts the cookie, the other person chooses which side of the cookie they get. It encourages both parties to view the division of resources in a fair way, and to work hard to make every part of the process quite fair. The other method of minimizing the egocentric bias is to take part in something called perspective taking. Now, this is actually something that has been researched quite a great deal within negotiations literature. And what we know is that if somebody actually goes through the effort to take a moment to take the perspective of the other party prior to the negotiation, to sit down and think, well, what would my counterparts think, feel, how would they view this problem? Um, Before you start to make judgments about your own situation, under these conditions, it can help you to get around this egocentric bias and to start to see the problem from other viewpoints, other lenses, which can lead to more creative and integrative decision making. Great. So those are some of the summary points from the idea of a social dilemma. I want to move on to talk about power and influence. Now, your textbook speaks about power and influence. The chapter 7 is on negotiation, power, and persuasion. So some of the ideas that I will highlight here can be found in your text, and you should read your text to deepen your understanding of them and also to expand on some of these ideas. So let me start by talking about the importance of influence. Now, sometimes when we say power and influence, we think about it in a malicious, manipulative way. But I want to remind you that influence is a key skill for individuals within organizations, particularly if you're going to be in managerial or leadership positions, if you're going to take part in teamwork, if you are in types of functions where sales or account management are important skills, and in any type of negotiation. And as we know, negotiation is something that we do all the time with all sorts of constituents across our work lives and our personal lives. So this idea of being able to have influence becomes a fairly important skill to learn and to develop over the course of one's work life. Just to drive home this point, it's important to note that powerful individuals can get the job done, secure resources, and get others on side. You can often see that somebody who is able to have influence can not only for their own purposes, but can also open doors for other people, get resources for other people, accomplish outcomes on behalf of others. So it becomes an important skill set in a variety of ways. So I'm going to go over a few of the really key sources of influence or power. The first slide here talks about source of personal power. How are the ways in which you as an individual can have power within a situation, can shift the power towards you? The first is through expertise. If you have special knowledge, special skill, special awareness of the issue, people will start to look to you as the individual to go to, and you will start to have a little bit of influence over how things turn out. So in the shark negotiation, if you had arrived, and you know there were some calculations within this negotiation that gave a few people a bit of a difficult start, and if you had shown up with understanding the calculations fully, being able to write them out, to recalculate on the fly, to demonstrate different sets and patterns of agreements that use these calculations, you would have demonstrated an expertise that would have given you an upper hand within this negotiation, would have given you, to the extent that you can explain it and have others understand your solution. So not overly complicated. I don't want this to be confused with the idea of snowballing as a tactic where you throw too much information at somebody. This is expertise in the sense where you understand something and you're able to clearly articulate a solution. That can be a source of power. The next source of power that I have listed here is this idea of attraction. I'm not talking about attraction in a romantic way. I'm talking about this feeling of genuinely liking somebody, thinking somebody's a good person, thinking that's somebody I could spend some time with. Right? When we hear examples of people talking about presidential hopefuls in the United States, sometimes we hear the question, "Well, could you have a beer with them?" Right? And what we're talking about is this power that comes with attraction. Now, often we think about this in the form coming in the form of charisma. So somebody who's able to speak well, can clearly articulate their ideas, is a very good storyteller. That can be a source of power. Physical appearance can often be a source of power. Now, it is true that attractiveness, so being we do know actually, and unfortunately in some ways, that physical attraction or being an what would typically be deemed as attractive in by cultural standards, can lead to to some influence. But what I'm also talking about is physical appearance in the sense where you look like you belong in this setting and that you have what it takes to be successful here. So that's why you often hear, you should wear a suit to an environment where suits are what's to be worn, or you need to be more casual in other environments. So physical appearance can be an indicator of power as well. Effort is another thing that will get you power within social circles. So think about group projects where you've had an individual who has put a lot into the group project, put a lot into organizing the people, into doing the research, and it's clear that that individual has really given something to this group project. Often that person is then given a little bit of power or sway or lenience. Let's say that there's something to be reconsidered or relooked at. We trust that individual, and we give them a little bit of credit for the effort that they've put into the work. So being somebody who always puts their best foot forward, who works hard, who's diligent, can give you a fair amount of personal power. And finally, there's the power that comes with legitimacy. This is the notion that if you are in a position of authority, if you're in a position that legitimately deserves recognition or power, it's a way to achieve it personally. And I think that one's pretty clear to us, right? That if you hold a legitimate role that that allows you to be the person that everybody looks to, that is indeed a source of power. Let's look more let's ask the question about, so the first slide was about personal power. Let's ask the question, how do we get positional power? So not legitimate power in the sense of the role that you take, but positional power in terms of how you find yourself related or connected to others. This is often studied using something called social network analysis, which is an important tool for us as researchers to understand how people are connected and what those connections mean in terms of, well, all kinds of things. People use them in healthcare, right, all the way to negotiations and power and influence, and learning. All sorts of researchers and research areas use this technique. But we're going to think about power as it comes from our position within our social network. One type of power that exists within a social network is this idea of centrality. So you are a person, you're a hub essentially. You're a person who has lots of people attached to them. So you're somebody who is well connected. All of those relationships might be at the same level as you. So that could be horizontal power. But it's horizontal relationships rather, but it's still power because you are still a person who has influence and sway among your peers. So think of an organization where you have maybe an accounting organization where you have level accountants that exist at various levels. Even our lowest level of accountant, if they're very connected with everybody within their peer group, they still have some sort of positional power because they become central to the types of ideas, the attitude, the work ethic of the people within the organization. There's also positional power that comes with being flexible. So being able to move back and forth, being able to do one role or another role, being able to work with different departments in different areas, being able to work with different types of people. This ability to move across units and sectors is another source of positional power. Who do we go to when we want to find out what's happening way over there, or who do we call when we want something done that is not straightforward, that requires us to link across groups? Well, we call somebody who we know to be quite flexible. Another source of power is visibility. This can be a tough one for some people, the idea of making their efforts and the work that they do known. This can be through self-promotion. It can be through, so the second point here is the idea that sometimes as a group we do the work, and then one person is elected or selected to present the project. To the extent that you are the person standing at the front of the room, even if there are 6 people on the project, if you're the one who actually does the presentation, you are given credit. You are given the credit for holding the ideas. So visibility becomes very important. And with visibility, you're focusing on what we call vertical relationships. You're looking upward to the people above you and the people below you. You're making yourself visible, not necessarily among your peer group, but among those around you who will also have important determinations on your outcomes. Finally, another source of positional power is relevance. The work that you do is relevant to the core task that we are trying to achieve. If you can be connected to the actual work that's being done, you have a great deal of power within the organization. So I'd like to finish by going over this idea of influence. So we talked about where your sources of power are. Now, how do you power on its own will give you opportunities to have influence. But what are some of the strategies, some of the interpersonal strategies that you can use to ensure that you have influence? I'll go over a few of my favorite here because I really feel these are some powerful strategies that you can use even starting today. The first is the idea of reciprocity. So this is simply that this is based on a social norm that exists, that has been with us since the beginning of time, that people who are, that when you give something to somebody, they want to give it back to you. They want to give something back to you. They feel indebted. So by giving, you're actually creating a sense of indebtedness. When you offer, you can try this. If you're sitting across from somebody at dinner, somebody who you like, if you're sitting across from somebody at dinner, if you offer them something that's on your plate, what will they almost certainly say? They will almost certainly say, "Would you like some of mine?" This is reciprocity at its finest. It's what our entire social structure is built upon. That's why we have money to exchange for goods. These are important. It's an important way in which we operate. The next bullet point refers to the fact that we have to identify opportunities when people are feeling this need to reciprocate. Now, there are a few opportunities that I think are important. One is the idea at the moment when somebody says thank you. If you have done something for somebody and they say thank you, often we diminish the favor with our response by saying, "No problem, don't worry about it." Do you know what will happen if we say those things? They'll think it's not a problem and they won't worry about it. If you want to ensure that that whatever you've done with somebody is understood as being something that you did because you wanted to do it, but something that you also something that's also put out there as I do these things because I know that it all comes back to me, right? So when somebody says thank you, a more appropriate thing to say would be, "I know you would do the same for me." A simple "you're welcome" is fine, but don't diminish the things that you do for others, because research tells us actually that the amount of indebtedness they feel goes down over time due to our response to the word thank you. So keep that in mind. The other thing to note is reciprocity also works in a negative sense, in the inverse. So while it could mean that somebody gives you something, it could also mean they give up something. So think about this under the conditions of concessions within a negotiation. If you give up something, if you make a concession, I will also make a concession out of reciprocity. So I have here that a moment of influence is when you hear the word no. This is essential. It's the same exact point. So if somebody offers you actually, this is a really good example because it's Girl Guide cookie season right now, and often we have Girl Guides that come to the door at our home, and they will say, would you like to buy Girl Guide cookies? I will sell you 3 boxes for $20, and or let's say 4 boxes for $20, and I will say no, thank you. I don't like Girl Guide cookies, actually, so I would say no, thank you. Almost certainly, I would say no. Um, and then she, being a very smart, savvy salesperson, this little Girl Guide would say to me, "How about 1 box for $6?" So she made a concession. She went from $20 to $6. I'm quite likely to make a concession and go from $0 to $6, or from 0 boxes to 1 box. So concessions work in the same way with regards to reciprocity. I actually had a really an opportunity to when I was teaching this once in a negotiations class. I had a student who put up her hand and said, I have a classic example, or a straightforward example, of how reciprocity works. And she said that she had brought the idea of getting a new laptop to her father, to which her father said, "No, you don't need a new laptop. We weren't in the market for a laptop this year." She said, "But you know, this MacBook Pro that's here, it's a great laptop, and here are the reasons why I need it." And he continued to say no. So finally, she relented a little bit and had already researched a Toshiba. And she said, "Well, how about this Toshiba?" So she went from, I don't know, a $2,000 laptop. I've lost track of the cost of MacBook Pros at the moment, and went to a Toshiba that is at least half the price. And her father went from a no to a yes, even though he was not in the market for a laptop this calendar year. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, that there are opportunities for influence, and the way in which we pay attention to language and conversation can help us to identify those opportunities. Another opportunity for influence is consistency. So this is described in your textbook as well. This is the moment where if you can get somebody to buy into something early on, to buy into the idea of something, to signal that something is attractive to them, then when it comes time to actually agree and make an agreement, people want to behave in ways that are consistent with their promises. So you can influence people by going to them early, consulting them early, and then when it comes time to make a decision, they'll want to behave in a way that is consistent with the promise they made at an earlier time. This happens this is part of, we're in election season right now. This is part of the reason why people will come to your door and ask the question, "Do you intend to vote in the upcoming election?" They ask that question not to, and they might even get you to sign something or to say, "Yes, I'll vote," and check off a box. They ask that question not because they're trying to count how many people expect to vote, but because they know that if they ask that question and can get you to make a promise or a commitment, that you'll be more likely to vote when election day does come around. The next opportunity for influence is a social proof. This is the moment when we see evidence of of something in the world around us. That evidence provides us with proof that this is the correct way to behave. So we often see this on the sidewalk. When you look at a busker, they have a busker would be a street performer. They have a basket open or a guitar case open. You never see a guitar case that a busker is using without some money in it already. So that money indicates to us that they are worth paying. It's a social proof, and then we are more likely to pay them if they have that in front of them. So if you can demonstrate that others are doing the same thing, that the people that you're talking to respect are doing it, then you'll see that you can have influence on the individual's behavior. The last one here is liking. This is very similar to our personal power up above, but this is a bit more active. So rather than passively waiting to be liked, this is about finding ways of finding overlap with another individual, finding ways to find similarity. We like people who are similar to us, so through conversation or through our interactions with others, identifying places where we can have some common ground. And this similarity can encourage us to like the other individual. This is a networking trick as well. If you're ever out networking and you want to get quickly connected with somebody, seek out the similarities between you as a way of encouraging that connection, right? So somebody might come up to me and say, I did my undergrad at McMaster University. When were you there? Oh, I was there in this year. And the automatic, or right away, we have something to talk about. There's a bit of warmth between us because of this shared experience. All right, so those are our opportunities for influence. So some of our learning points today, expand. So some of the learning points around this learning and influence piece is expand your network, make sure that you're visible, make sure that you're flexible within your network, be seen as an expert wherever possible, put forward a good effort, keep on giving, be sure to make sure that you continue to create situations where reciprocity is possible, seek out no's. So under conditions where you have two very good offers, make sure you start with a bigger offer so that the other individual can welcome a concession, so that you can encourage a back and forth of concession making. Now, you might say you're welcome for this lecture. I will offer that it was a big deal, that I'm happy to do it. I know you would do the same for me. And I hope that you enjoyed today's topic. All right, so next week, there's an additional reading in the York the York Library. You also have to read chapter 7 of the text. It says chapter 5 here, but it's chapter 7. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.